Chapter 39. In the dead of night. From within the protection of the castle walls, nothing could be heard of the carnage outside but the occasional yell within the city, or another one of the echoing roars from beyond the wall. "What is going on out there?" Layla mumbled to herself, as she whipped her hair out of her face and made for the window. She had to lean out to a dangerous length, and look as sharply as she could to the left to see the wall. It would have been invisible now that the sun had set, if not for the hundreds of torches that made it look like a long orange serpent, winding around the city's front. She often sat in the comfort of a warm room knowing a battle raged somewhere else with Caleb or Anselm in the middle of it, but it was hardly a feeling she could get used to. This time was worst of all. She knew at least that Anselm and Alastra would likely be the safest atop the wall, but Caleb was at the front, and an unusually terrible feeling brewed inside of her. She looked down at the ring on her left hand, the ring Caleb had given her, and ran a finger along its silver band, trying to fight back the common thoughts of how she would go on if he were to die. She was good at fending those off at least, but the odd, gloomy feeling still gnawed at her heart. Normally she would have passed it off as nerves, but she was different now. Ever since leaving Avondale, her dreams had become more frequent, the images of people and places far and near more vivid, and she could no longer tell what was true and what was imagination. What was worry and what was premonition? She pulled away from the window and shivered from the night breeze snaking its way into the room. She shook her head, finally deciding to shut the glass on the window, and wrapping herself in a thick fur blanket sat down on the edge of her bed. She closed her eyes and focused on the thoughts running through her mind. Fate help me in my worthlessness. If only there was something I could do for them. I can fight. She knew she could hold her own, but not well enough to be of any help to them. She knew she would die if she set one foot outside the walls. She had to think. I know the city. And so much about that man Paulson. So many others, both friend and enemy here. All useless information. There must be something I can do. She thought on the dreams she'd had. She thought of Paulson and of his home in the Esterlands, the place with the red rocky cliffs. She could still see him there walking along the shore with friends by his side, and could see his home, a small two-story building made of stone and clay mortar. And beyond a wide and well-kept plum orchard. She began to look beyond even the orchard for the first time, but the image switched in her mind's eye to a Faldetian guard she sometimes saw patrolling the hallways outside her room. For some reason she was now thinking of him and his wife and their 3 children. She had a temper, and the children were always wild. Their home was small, 2 stories tall, and with a quaint stone cellar under the kitchen floor. She shook her head and buried her face in her hands. The thoughts never went away. So many people and places. An old man somewhere on a cold, desolate island, a Sartir warrior marching in an unknown land beyond the Great Waste, even a cat in the city stalking a mouse down a dark street. There was no order to it all. No answers. Fate. I am losing my mind. She breathed in deeply and refocused her thoughts to the present, pushing away everything else that demanded center stage on the platform of her mind. But before she knew what she was doing, she was walking along the streets of Paladar. She knew them well now, traveling up and down each alleyway and side street, noting over and over again the smallest details of every single building along the way. She had mostly overcome the fear of what was happening inside of her, and now simply wanted to understand why and how. To her surprise, just then it happened again. At the speed of a sunray, her thoughts raced toward one end of the city, a quiet corner on the northwestern side down a street lined with storehouses filled with lumber and coal. She knew the street, but somehow had not noticed something there before now. She could see that the back wall of one such storehouse, the third from the last, was made up of old crumbling stone built much more recently and hastily than the rest. She saw it clearly in her mind, as if she were standing there at that very moment, and she stared at it with curiosity. What is this? Why have I never seen this before? The loud noise of men running down the hallway outside her room made her jump, and her face came up out of her hands in surprise. She listened as the men in the hall, most likely more soldiers or messengers, dashed past, their voices and clanking armor fading as they moved down the stairs at the end of the hall and out of earshot. She shook her head again. Was I dreaming? Her head pounded. The strange thoughts and visions were always more prevalent and overpowering when she was alone. Having someone around to talk to cleared her mind. She looked at Leothrin's empty bed across the room, and wished more than ever that anyone was here to take her mind away from things. She even wished Elastra were here if it provided an escape from herself. I am tired and worried. Perhaps I should try and get some sleep instead of sitting here losing my mind. Yes, this night it is all in my head. Everyone, Caleb, please come back. She lay on her side on the bed, and watched the flames flicker in the fireplace over her fur blanket. It seemed that she tried to sleep for hours, but she was sure it was only minutes. Each time she closed her eyes she would see the lonely storehouse again and the stone wall at the back. She tried to think of home. Of her father and brothers, and what they were doing at that moment, and how Tritis was faring in its recovery. But always her thoughts took her back to the streets of Paladar, along the inside of the wall to the northwestern corner and back to the storehouse again. A tear came to her eye as fear began to creep in again and fill her mind with doubt. She was alone and scared and felt more trapped than ever with her head pounding harder. Despite her greatest efforts, she started to cry, but only for a moment before she realized something that had not occurred to her before. It hit her as if someone had pounded her over the head with a stone. She let herself think of the stone wall and noticed that indeed there was another detail. Unlike the rest of her vague jumble of visions, this one included the glow of orange lights from the city wall and cries of war in the distance. She sat up, letting the blanket fall to the floor. Am I seeing a dream of this very night? That wall. Why did I not know of it before now? Is there something there at this moment? Before she could stop herself, she was out of the bed and pacing the floor in thought. She recalled the time in the forests of Avondale, when they were on the road to Shorewell. She had seen the dream of the tall figure watching them, and then that same night, she and Caleb had seen him actually there. She could not deny to herself that somehow she had predicted future events, or rather current events. Still not sure what she was doing, she ran to her armoire and stripped off her nightgown, replacing it with her travel clothes, boots and cloak, and armed herself with her faithful recurve bow with the horn tips and the short sword she had taken from the forges back home. She headed for the door, and it was not until she saw herself walk past the large mirror on the wall that she stopped and thought about what she was doing. Her hair was jumbled and unkempt from her difficult night, and her eyes held a frightened, empty look she had never seen before. She reached her hand to her cheek to be sure she was real, and approached the mirror absently. She closed her eyes to steady herself, but when she opened them again, she jumped back in fear. Her reflection had been replaced by a cloaked, hooded woman, gazing at her with deep, soulless green eyes, empty and vast like the unbroken surface of the sea. The woman removed her hood, revealing long white hair, and without blinking slowly brought her hand to her face and tapped her forehead twice. Layla started back with an unearthly scream that echoed only through her mind. She found herself clinging to the opposite wall, panting hard and scarcely daring to look back, but couldn't resist. She breathed a sigh of relief to see that the reflection was hers once again. She looked into her own green eyes and fought away the frightened and hopeless look. What was that? A spectre from beyond. Seeing strangers in her mind was all too familiar, but she had to work for a moment to push this one away and refocus. She sent up a silent plea to fate that she would not encounter the strange figure again. She looked around the empty room, confused at finding herself there. Another glance in the mirror at her armor and weapons brought her back to her purpose. The wall. Of course. There must be something there I am meant to do. And anyway, it is better than sitting in here alone with my thoughts. I can be there in half an hour if I make haste. There must be something. She tried to concentrate, hoping she could notice anything else, but all she could see was the same image of the stone repository wall, lined with bound bundles of logs and stacks of boxes and barrels. She opened the door and left the room without looking back, and hurried down through the levels of the castle and out into the courtyard. When she came to the gates of the castle that would lead her into the city, she was greeted by 20 soldiers armed with 10-foot lancers who stopped her with a friendly call. "My lady. You mustn't be out," one said, stepping forward to block her path. "There is war afoot out there, do you not know? It isn't safe even here. Please go back to the castle and let us attend to the affairs of the war." Layla wore a look of fierce determination, and looked up and down the row of men, all of whom were watching her with puzzlement. "I must pass. Please let me through," she said. The soldier looked at the bow on her back and the sword at her side and shook his head. Another came up behind him and whispered in his ear, and the first one spoke again. "So you are one of the company from Tritus, no?" he said. "Milady, you honor us with your presence. Your valor is great, but there are plenty of trained men carrying this battle. It would serve us all best for you to wait inside." "I know that," she snapped, taking the soldier by surprise. "I am not going off to get myself killed in the war. Do you think me a fool? I assure you I will go nowhere near the city gates. I have urgent business to be about." The soldier looked more confused than ever now. He looked back to some of the others, who gave him a shrug in return. "What kind of business? If there is a message to be delivered, I implore you, leave it with us, and I shall send someone at once to deliver it. Does that suit you?" "No, it does not," Layla said impatiently. "And it is business that I have no time to explain right now." She laughed inside at the thought of even trying to explain. She paused briefly, realizing passing these guards could be a simple task for her. She looked into his eyes for a brief moment. "I am under orders from King Brackmore himself with urgent business in the city. He said to inform you that if you hinder me, you shall have to answer to your brother, and you may yet be suspended from your station." Again. The guardsman looked profoundly shocked. "My brother? How does the king know of that rat's foul play? He must be spreading his venomous lies all throughout the chamber guard." Layla prodded him with an impatient look. He shook his head and cleared his throat. "Forgive me, milady. If you have been in council with the king, then I have no choice. Open the gates," he ordered a few of the others. "But you must promise me you'll take care, and immediately return upon finishing your business. And do not go near the city gates." "I swear it on my life," Layla responded with a mixture of pride and shame for what she had done, a new realization of the potential of her abilities dawning on her. At length they reluctantly made a path down the middle of their number, and a few of them turned the large chain cranks at either side of the door, and they slowly parted open with a loud moaning creak. "Be careful, milady," the soldier said. "Honor your promise." She gave him a bow and a hasty smile, and bolted off through the gates and into the city, while a dozen confused gazers went to their leader, who was red in the face and barking frustrations. She knew the quickest way to get there. She ran down the broad stairway before the castle wall and straight ahead along the main road that led to the city gates, but veered off to the right at the second road that forked away. She darted down that street, looking up at the multi-level homes that belonged to the wealthier citizens of Paladar. The torch posts that lined the road glowed brightly, but most of the windows of the homes were dark. However, she did notice plenty of people inside keeping watch through slits in the window curtains or through the crack of a door. She could feel others too, people she could not see but somehow she knew were there. A little boy crouched in the dark. A woman clutching to her husband and weeping. All of them were most likely armed and keeping a sharp eye out, anticipating the potential battle that could come to their doorsteps if the fight went ill on the fields. She stopped and clutched her knees to catch her breath before continuing on at a slower pace through a narrow alley, and at last around a corner to the long lane that ran alongside the city wall itself, filled with run-down, boarded-up shops and storehouses. Without even having to think, she walked directly to the one she had seen and stopped in front of it. Although she had seen it just a while before, it was only now that she noticed the storehouse was actually built into the wall of the city. The building had no windows, and she was pleased to find that the heavy wooden door on its face was unlocked. She pulled it open and stared into the blackness inside. Opening the door to let in as much light from the street torches pour in as she could, she saw that the place was all but empty save for the storage crates and barrels she had seen before, all of which were piled against the back. She knew there was little chance of any danger inside, but she drew her sword all the same. Everything was as silent as death. Even the faint sounds of war seemed to disappear as she crept into the darkness. As she approached the back of the storehouse, the dim light from outside revealed the wall she had seen. It was strong to be sure, but looked as though it had once been an opening that was built over years later. The stone was crumbling, and the thick mortar that held them together was falling to pieces into piles on the ground. Just an old wall. There's nothing here. Why? This has to be important. Fate, I am a fool. She stood there in the darkness in thought, trying to find an answer, but the answer came to her instead. She was jolted from her contemplation when a loud crashing noise echoed through the empty room, and the entire wall in front of her shook. Before she could even take in what had just happened, the same thing repeated and she took a step backwards. An earthquake? No. Another bang came, and this time dust exploded from in between the stones and small pebbles of rock tumbled to her feet. Taking courage, she stepped closer and leaned into the wall. It was then that she heard, ever so faintly, the unmistakable high-pitched noise of gruel chatter mingled with yelling and screaming. No. Talgathians are on the other side and trying to break through. That means the bridge was taken. Her heart sank and her thoughts jumped to Caleb again. Was he dead? Hope vanished from her heart in that moment, and she walked backwards toward the door in despair but stopped just short of the entrance. Wait. Layla, wait, you coward. This is why I am here. I was brought to this wall so that I could stop them from breaking through. This is what I can do. There is no running now. But how do I stop them? Sheathing her sword, she set her mind to work at once. The wall they were attempting to breach was thick, and she knew she had plenty of time before they could come through. Even then, it was likely they could only make an entrance big enough for 2 or 3 of them to come in at a time. She was certain only a small number of the enemy had come this far from the battle at the city front. She could feel their numbers were few. All she needed to do was to make their way impassable once they broke through. She tied up her hair and looked frantically around the room for anything she could use. It all came together quickly. Old knotted log pillars ran from the dirt floor to the stone ceiling. Along the back wall, wood bundles and coal lay in piles. She started immediately tugging at the heavy crates of coal to move them to the pillars, but found them much too heavy. Instead, she put her back against the shaking wall behind them and pushed with both legs until they toppled over, spilling the coal all over the ground. She hurriedly piled as much of it as she could around the base of the pillars, and then snatched up armloads of the chopped wood and loaded them on top. Over the next 20 minutes, she ran back and forth from the wall to the pillars, dumping wood and coal onto the stacks at their bases and making her arms and torso increasingly black with soot, ash and grime from the aging supplies. When she felt the piles were sufficient, she drew her sword to weaken the pillars as much as she could before setting them aflame. Her blacksmith instinct screamed as she hacked away at the pillar with her blade, breaking one of the most fundamental rules of proper sword care, but she did not heed them. All that mattered now was sealing off this entrance, even if it did damage her custom steel beyond repair. She chopped away at each pillar as much as she dared before racing back into the street and heading for one of the torch poles with a long shank in her hand from one of the wood piles inside. Pulling her handkerchief from her pocket and wrapping it around the wooden plank in her hand, she shimmied up the pole to light it. Once the fire caught, she jumped back down to the ground, making sure not to kill the flame, and raced back inside to light the wood. It took a moment for the wood at the top of her piles to accept the torch, but once it transferred, the dryness ate it up and grew rapidly, illuminating the room entirely. She ran around to the other piles and lit them before her torch could burn too low. By the time the last one went up, she found herself in the middle of a roaring oven and sprinted for the door with her mouth covered to block the smoke. Back out into the night she ran and threw herself onto the ground, coughing and rubbing her eyes. Sweat on her forehead and down her back stung with cold in the night air, and her hair was half falling out of its place on the back of her head. She sat there on the dirt road and watched as flames shot out and upward from the door. The fire could not spread through stone, ensuring the safety of the rest of the street, but she prayed that the pillars collapsing would be enough to do the job. More time passed by, and just as she was starting to doubt the effectiveness of her plan, she smiled as she heard the loud cracking noise of one of the pillars giving way. Then another shortly after. Finally, the other 2 were burned through, and all at once the building's roof caved at the middle and the upper part of the walls fell inward on top of it. She ran further back to the other side of the street and covered herself as flames and smoke burst into a cloud across the lane. Layla breathed a sigh of relief as she watched the cloud clear to see the city wall still intact as far as she could tell, and nothing but an enormous mound of rubble, 30 paces tall and 50 wide, sitting against it. Nothing would get through. She nodded with satisfaction, but realized that she had better leave the lane as quickly as possible before she herself was mistaken for an enemy. Even as the thought crossed her mind, she suddenly spotted something moving from the corner of her eye, and her heart jumped. Her first thought was that somehow a gruel had gotten through, or that a soldier had come to investigate, and her hand went to her sword hilt, but she froze at what she saw instead. A small boy who looked no older than 10 years of age stood there staring at her. Not at the rubble or dying flames beneath them, but at her. He was wearing plain clothing and light shoes, and had an expression of total and utter neutrality. He was not sad or scared, nor angry or confused. He just stood and stared, blinking. Layla regained control of her speeding heart, and let go of the sword on her side as she hastily stood and made her way to the boy. "What in fate's name are you doing here? It is dangerous outside," she scolded. The intensity of the moment caused the words to come out a little too harshly. She stopped short in front of him, and the boy looked her up and down. Layla knew that a small boy such as this, out in the night during a battle, would have searching parents close behind, and the last thing she wanted was to draw any attention before she could get back to the castle. "Where are your parents? Come, show me where you live, and I shall take you home at once. There is war outside the city, don't you know?" She tried to sound as comforting as she could. The boy's expression did not change much, but his eyes narrowed as if he were pondering her words. Suddenly she could hear the voices of a group of city guardsmen approaching, and she quickly took the boy into the shadows between two buildings. She braved to look around the corner, and watched them run around the rubble of the fallen repository in a panic, then holler to each other as they raced away again. Layla and the boy exited the narrow alley the opposite way, and emerged onto another dark lane, quiet and void of life. "They will be back soon," Layla said. "I must be going." "Where do you live?" The boy walked a few paces and turned and looked up at her. "Woman, my home is far from here." His voice made her heart skip a beat, though she could not say just why. There was something different about it, or perhaps something familiar. It was the voice of a boy, but somehow sounded more cultured than most adults. Even his simple words were strong and penetrating. "Far or not, I am sure we can manage," Layla said. "I have come for another purpose," the boy responded. Layla did not know what he meant. She opened her mouth to ask, but he spoke again. "There is much doubt and confusion within you. A shadow follows your every step and fills your heart with fear, but you must allow it in and embrace it." Layla was astounded by the elegant speech of the lad, though his words made little sense. "Do not fear for me, boy," she said with a smile. "You must be frightened of this war also. You are brave to show such courage." "I speak not of a battle of blood and steel," he answered without a pause, "but of the one waging within your heart and within your mind." "Within my mind?" Layla stammered. "Do not be afraid," the boy continued. "Let your heart be at peace. Cling to the power and know that all things are as they should be. Your life is reserved for a purpose most important to this world and those who fill it. Those whom you love." Sudden waking visions flashed through her mind with rapid succession, scenes of everyone she cared for, those in Avondale and on the battlefield, and from far away in her past. Overwhelmed, she clutched her head with a sharp gasp. All at once, Layla's feelings of security disappeared, and were replaced with an eerie, unnamed feeling that she was not looking at a mere boy, but something else entirely. Something was not right, and a chill traveled up her spine. The thought crossed her mind to call for help, but she could not utter a sound. "Of what do you speak?" Layla asked. The boy's eyes were wide and deep, and as she looked into them it was as though a strong coursing current of water was pulling her in. "Do not be afraid," he repeated. His words were piercing. His tone too pure. His face devoid of human nature. Layla bumped into the wall of the building behind her, and she realized she had been slowly retreating backward. She swallowed and pushed her dirty hair away from her face. "Who are you?"
Thank you for listening. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Episodes go live every Monday and Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The audiobook can be purchased in its entirety on Google Play Books. Get the whole trilogy now in both paperback and ebook formats. All links are in the description.